welcome. In the computer age, big data is a mixed blessing. When corporations gather terabytes of information about us, it can enhance our lives with offers of just the right stuff, even free services like Google Search and email. But of course, big data in corporate and government hands can invade our privacy and threaten our freedom. Today, however, a new wrinkle in all this. We learn about a business that gathers and sells big data about corporations in order to encourage them, even shame them, into acting responsibly and transparently, both socially and environmentally. Transparency for sale in a moment. Also on the program today, commentator Greg David will drop by to explain why he sees an uptick in New York's unemployment rate as maybe a good thing, and why Bill de Blasio is a lucky mayor, in Greg's opinion. Then in our public intellectual segment, we hear about a study that suggests Americans think of politics as a team sport, that is more rooting than thinking going on. And towards the end of the hour, the Central Park Arch Project, a proposal to keep bikers and pedestrians from colliding by rebuilding arches that master builder Robert Moses once tore down. First, though, a unique business called CSR Hub. It has assembled a huge database showing the level of social responsibility and environmental sustainability of some 14,000 corporations from 135 industries in 127 countries. This to allow activists, researchers, and business managers to plainly see, for example, how wholesome Whole Foods or Apple Computer truly are. The co-founder of CSR Hub joins us now. He's also the CEO, Bahar Gidwani, and with us via Skype from Seattle, Kevin Hagen, Director of Corporate Responsibility at Iron Mountain, the document storage company with 1,000 facilities worldwide. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Brian. I'm so glad to be here.
Explain this, transparency for sale, in effect.
Well, the idea is that everybody wants to understand how corporations are performing socially. There's a real interest now among employees, among government, within NGOs, among activists, consumers. There's also an interest on Wall Street in knowing whether or not a company is behaving well to its community, to its employees, to the environment, and whether or not it's well governed. Well, we found that this information was not readily available in the past. There were lots and lots of different sources of information. In fact, we've currently gathered together 380 of them into our database, but the sources of information didn't fit together very well. They were disparate, they gave conflicting signals, and it was very hard for people to use them in a business sense. By bringing all that data together into one large database using big data techniques, as you mentioned, we've built something that corporations can look at as a feedback loop. They improve their performance internally, it shows up in our database externally. They can then improve further and have it show up further as well. And that can be shared across all of society through our database.
Now, before we bring in Kevin, I want to put up a graphic from CSR Hub that's going to show us an example of this, and viewers, you'll be able to see this graphically laid out. So this is what they call their dashboard, competitor, benchmark, and look at these companies that you know, Google, Apple, Walmart, Amazon, and you'll see the various categories on which they are scored. So these are the things that you were saying a moment ago, but now we can see them visually laid out. So community, employees, environment, and governance. What does community mean in this respect? And why, for example, does Google rate well with a 57?
Well, community has to do with how a company relates to things like human rights and supply chain. Does it have bad labor policies in its supply chain? Is it using child labor, things like that? It relates to things like philanthropy. Is a company giving to its community through charitable outreach? And it also has to do with whether the product itself makes society better. Well, Google actually has had a reputation for very strong philanthropy. It doesn't really have a human rights and supply chain problem because it's not manufacturing anything that can be made in bad ways.
Right.
And it does have, in fact, a product that has been seen by society, generally speaking, as having positive effects as far as transparency is concerned. If you contrast that, and I'm not saying Amazon is a bad company, but if you contrast that against somebody like Amazon, Amazon has been seen as, for instance, putting smaller companies out of business, destroying local economies. I don't think it's necessarily true, but that's how it's seen. And what we're measuring then is the perception that somebody like Amazon is not necessarily as strong or as positive for a community when it moves in as somebody like Google.
So on the lower chart, the category percentile ranks, you can really see the disparity with Google in the community category at 52.8% and Amazon all the way down at 6%.
The way these things work is that there's a lot of companies kind of in the middle, and then there are tails out to the two ends. Fortunately, there are no companies in our system that are at 0 score, that are absolutely so horrible they should be put out of business. Unfortunately, there also aren't any companies above 75 or so. There still is a long way for companies to go on the sustainability thing, but at least there are people who are leaders, there are people who are laggards, and the wonderful thing is that somebody at Amazon who's studying their own social performance can now look off across a whole range of different competitors, from local ones like Amazon to people like Alibaba in China, who we also rate, and see how are they doing on various different measures, what kinds of programs need to be put into place to improve their performance.
And people like Kevin Hagen in Seattle. Hi, Kevin. Tell us why this is useful for you and useful to Iron Mountain.
Well, it's always challenging to take one snapshot in time and understand what that means over the long haul. But I think it's really helpful to be able to have some objective data. We only see sometimes as close as we can look inside of our walls. And a lot of times being able to have some objective information from outside is really helpful in understanding how we're really doing against compared to other organizations, and how we're doing against what we think we're doing ourselves. So it can be really helpful to have that objective viewpoint.
How much is this a matter of the perception of your values by people who you might want to hire? Are millennials, who I think you're probably hiring disproportionately to other age groups, correct me if I'm wrong, looking at these kinds of things more as a criteria for even who they apply to for work?
It's interesting. The corporate responsibility space has been driven by a lot of engines, from activist interest to investor interest. And in fact, prospective employees are certainly one of the big audiences for this information. Being able to understand who you're going to go to work for is pretty important. And I think that whether it's just because you want to work with an organization that matches your values better, or whether you, like some investors, see that advancing on corporate responsibility agendas is actually tied to business performance, where companies who are outperforming in this space are outperforming on the economic space as well. So whether you're looking for how this business is going to fare over the long haul, or whether you're looking for a values match, I think this kind of objective evidence is another great example of how you could use that.
And you were with REI previously. Was it like that there too?
Yeah. The REI, the nation's largest co-op, was a great stint for me personally. And I think it's another great example of businesses that have reputations. It's one data point to look at how you think of that organization or how you interact with it. It's another to have this objective evidence that looks across a wide variety of sources to understand the big picture.
So, Bahar, you said before that companies should use this as a feedback loop, and you should see improvement in various categories on the part of companies that buy your data. Can you give me a good example of that, of how a company went up from where they started?
Well, I've seen it in a lot of different companies. A nice example might be Apple, following Tim Cook's arrival. They've taken steps such as, for instance, publishing their list of their suppliers. They've taken steps such as improving or encouraging more diversity within their workforce. And recently I saw them take the step of changing over 2 of their data centers to being fully renewable in their energy sources. So these are the kinds of public commitments, I think, that count both with consumers and also with the other kinds of stakeholders that Kevin was talking about. We saw recently a nice decision by CVS, one of our favorite companies that we see all the time here in New York, to stop selling tobacco. Difficult decision. I think they weighed a lot of different aspects when they were thinking about it. They certainly gave up some revenue, but they felt that it appealed to their employees. They felt that it appealed to their customers. And I think what we're going to see, I hope we're going to see over these next couple of years, is more and more places in which companies do sustainability-related things for operating benefits. I suspect somebody at CVS did the final calculus and decided that, yes, they might lose some revenue short term, but long term, they'd have more revenue growth, a stronger brand, less reputation risk, maybe even a lower cost of credit. And all of these things would come together to more than pay for the initial costs that they had.
Kevin, is there any example with your company that you could cite where you saw your rankings in one category or another and decided to change something as a result?
Well, I'd be cautious. I don't think we're chasing the rankings, but there are great objective evidence after the fact of maybe some things we've done. So definitely it's an indicator of where we can look at opportunities and then play that into the business card of where can we leverage that into opportunities. So a good example would be, renewable energy is a great one. We looked at our portfolio of where our energy comes from and started to understand that by measuring CO2 impact in our portfolio, we were actually figuring out something that we couldn't see otherwise. It was a proxy for risk. And so we were starting to look at our business analysis differently. By understanding that, we started to figure that we could use renewable energy as a hedge against future cost of energy exposure. And in terms of our portfolio, we ended up starting to make some decisions about purchasing solar or using contracts to buy solar power because there's no future cost escalation. So we can lock in pricing now and be more comfortable and associated with risk in the future. So I think it's a great example of something that we may not have seen in the ordinary course of business, but looking through this new lens allowed us to see something we might not have also seen. That led to a business decision, and that led to good business outcomes.
That's very interesting. Now, let's talk about your company a little bit itself. It's what's called a B corporation, which is only a few years old as a status for a company here in New York State. And it actually is supposed to combine a for-profit mission and a non-profit mission.
Yeah. It's a very interesting idea, I think, and one that's consistent with our overall goal, what we've been trying to achieve. The idea is that many companies do have, in fact, a social mission or something that they're trying to achieve, besides making or in addition to making money. Well, why not display this publicly? Why not talk about it? Why not put it explicitly on the table so people know what you're doing? In our case, we're trying to make money, but we're also trying to use transparency to change corporate behavior. That made us an ideal candidate to be a B corporation. And there are about 3,000 B corporations that have gone through a rating process called GEARS, which ensures that, in fact, they are really sticking with their mission, that they're really kind of doing the things they say they're supposed to do. B Corporation designation is supposed to help you on a marketing basis. And in fact, I know a number of people who have thought that we're a really good group to come and buy data from because they trust us. They know we're a B Corp. They know we're really sincere about it. It's also supposed to help you raise money. One of the reasons the founders got about this was they said there's a whole group of investors who not only want to invest in something to make money, but invest in something to affect social change. So we're part of what they call impact investing or social investing. It's an ongoing trend right now, and B Corps are at the core of that.
Interesting. Etsy is another B corporation.
Etsy is a B Corp.
Seventh generation.
Etsy is our first public one, so we're very proud of that. B corporations now are allowed in most states. It's, I think, 30 states within the U.S., including core ones like New York, Delaware, California, and Illinois, where many companies are incorporated. So it's a choice that you can make when you go in to incorporate your company. It's also a choice you can make even after you've incorporated your company. We're actually an LLC that elected B Corp on top of our LLC.
How does anybody know that some B Corp or other doesn't just state that it has a social mission and then just goes on to make profit in it by any means?
Well, the long term in this, I hope, is that something like CSR Hub will provide them with that information. We don't just rate publicly traded companies, we also rate privately traded companies. And our goal is to make a sustainability rating something like what you have in credit ratings. Credit ratings promote trust. They promote transparency and the opportunity to do business with people you've never met before. Sustainability ratings should be the same way. And if a B Corp isn't really doing what it said it should, it'll end up with a low CSR Hub rating as opposed to some other, maybe not B Corp, that really is doing the right thing socially.
Kevin, before you go, just give us the long-range goal for Iron Mountain. What would make you consider yourself a success?
Now, certainly the dream of everyone is to try to arrive at some sustainable place. I think right now, as getting started in this process, we're a little more reserved in our efforts. I think right now our goal is to know, to disclose, and to address the social and environmental impacts of our business across all the places where our business touches. And that alone is a pretty big challenge right now.
And are U.S. companies overall, as far as you could tell, are from where you sit, actually improving on these social responsibility measures?
Yes. I'm very proud to say that the U.S. is behind, but not as far behind as it used to be. You're seeing U.S. companies cut 5 or 10% a year from their carbon use. Much better, I'm afraid to say, than most of us. You're seeing them add more women to their boards, improve their diversity programs. You're seeing an awful lot of very positive things coming out of U.S. companies. I think they've learned from European companies in particular. I think they are ahead of Asian and rest of world companies, but they are bound into now a fabric of supply interactions and things like that all around the world. And we're seeing one company influence another company, and tie their policies together worldwide.
And consumers can see your data too, right?
Yes. Come to csrhub.com. You can look at any of 14,000 public or private companies. We also have universities are in there. We have not-for-profits. I don't know if we have CUNY in there yet, but we probably should.
So why would companies pay you for your data if anybody can go and look it up for free?
We're a classic internet startup. We're big data, but we're also what they call a freemium site. So you can see a little bit of data, and then if you want to see more or get all the juicy tools that we have, Excel spreadsheets and everything, you got to pay something.
So what's your long-term goal?
Well, we would like to be a very successful internet startup, but we'd also like eventually to become something that is a core part of business decisions. We'd like you to go into a supermarket, look at a bottle of water or a cup or any other product, be able to stick your cell phone at it and see, is this cup better to buy than that cup? Should I get this bottle of water or that one? And we'd like you to figure out when you want to go for your next job, which major network should you join? You've got to be able to pick them, and maybe one of them has a better set of policies than the other.
And, of course, I will be able to pick and choose.
I know you will.
Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Time for Gregonomics, a close look at the money and politics driving New York from Greg David, who directs the Business and Economics Reporting Program at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Greg promises to tell us about the luck of Bill de Blasio, corruption blowback in Albany, and why the rising jobless numbers should make us smile at least a little bit. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Good. So much going on, I hardly know where to start, but how about the luck of Bill de Blasio? Why did you write a column for Crain's calling him a lucky mayor?
I think he's the luckiest guy around. He's a progressive, and in the last year he's been able to add $1 billion in the budget to help the homeless, to add mental health services, to do kinds of things with the schools, and, by the way, give all the municipal workers good raises, and then be completely fiscally responsible by not only doing balanced budgets, but he socked away another $2 billion for rainy days. He's got more than $4 billion. I think I said million. He socked away $2 billion. Now he's got more than $4 billion in reserves. I mean, how could you get luckier than that?
So it's easy to be a big government liberal if the economy is booming and you have all this tax money coming in to spend.
An unbelievable amount. So I went back and I looked at 2009 to 2019, which is as far as his budget projections go. In those 10 years, tax revenues in the city will increase by 60%. The budget will increase by 44% if the projections hold true. Inflation is low, so these are enormous increases, and there are two reasons, of course. The city's income tax produces enormous amounts of income in good time, most of it paid by a very small number of people. The top 1% pay about 40%. The top 10% pay 3/4 of the income tax. In addition, soaring property tax values are lifting property taxes. So, the city is awash in money.
Interesting. And even by the standards of pre-2009, 2009, of course, was the bottom of the financial crisis. So we hope that revenues from taxes are going to grow a lot compared to then. But I see your numbers, even compared to sort of more normal times before that, the economy is really booming when measured by how much tax revenue it's producing for the city.
You'd get about 40% if you went back to a better year, which is 2008, which is still a lot of money. Now, there is one difference. Since I wrote the column, I've been getting tweets about, have you thought of this, have you thought of that? People said, was Giuliani equally lucky? Was Bloomberg equally lucky?
Clinton, too. That whole 90s, Clinton, Giuliani. Oh, people love Clinton. Does that mean liberal policies work? Oh, people love Giuliani. Does that mean conservative policies work? It was all because the economy happened to boom?
But Giuliani and Bloomberg cut taxes, and they cut taxes so that they wouldn't build in this very high base for when times got bad. So that's a difference this time, because Bill de Blasio is not cutting taxes. He hasn't talked about raising them lately, but he clearly is not interested in cutting taxes.
Is there enough in the rainy day fund? Because the rainy day will come.
It's a lot. $4 billion is a lot. But in that year from 2009 when the recession hit, income taxes fell by $2.5 billion in 1 year. If we had something like that happen again, the rainy day fund could be wiped out in just a little more than a year. I guess he's hoping for a couple more good years and build it up some more.
All right. The other topic that we teased was why you think it's good, in a way at least, that unemployment numbers are rising in New York even while they're falling nationwide?
They're ticking up in New York while they're ticking down nationwide. The New York City unemployment rate is a full percentage point higher than the rest of the country.
And here we're going to put up a graphic, and you can walk us through this chart.
Well, let me get to that chart in a second. So why is that the case? Well, how do we figure the unemployment rate? It's the number of people in the workforce who are not working. But we define the workforce very specifically. You must either have a job or be looking for a job within the last 4 weeks.
In other words, if you're so unemployed that you've given up, you're not counted as unemployed. And so it really can be misleading in
Absolutely,
that respect.
It's misleading. So what's happening in New York? We have this enormous job boom. People are saying, I can get a job. They're re-entering the workforce. They don't get jobs right away. And while the unemployment rate has ticked up, the workforce in New York is at a record high. So this is a good sign because these people will get jobs.
And that's what we're seeing with the gray curve, New York City on the bottom. The national curve is the yellow. And that's workforce participation, which means people who are optimistic enough to even go out and look for work, even if they're unemployed at the moment.
Right. And the most important thing about that chart is that ever since 1976, New York City has lagged the country. We're well below the national labor force participation rate. But we are almost equal to the country now. And the country's going down.
Why is the country going down?
It is an incredibly controversial issue. Is it because the baby boomers are retiring? Is it because women have started to work less than they used to? Is it because people won't invest, and this is because Obama's ruined the economy? People are fighting about that issue nonstop. The labor force participation rate should be going down some, but not that much. But in New York, it's going up. It's going up because our labor force is changing. All these young people are moving to New York to take advantage. We've heard a lot of moaning about low-wage jobs, but low-wage jobs are offering employment opportunities to people with fewer skills. This is one of the best signs about how New York has improved against the rest of the country.
And even, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, as Wall Street, our main economic driver for so many decades, shrinks,
is stable, whatever. It's not driving this economy. Is it still producing a lot of money, high-paying jobs? It has those. It is contracting a bit. No, the real drivers are on the low end, retail and tourism jobs, a lot of tech jobs, a lot of advertising jobs. Business services is booming in New York, and those are pretty good paying jobs. Tech jobs average pay is north of $60,000. It's the number 2 industry in that regard to Wall Street.
I saw a real estate stat that came out this week that apartments for sale in Manhattan are extremely low, extremely few. Does that mean that it's a good real estate market? If people are, I don't know, if people can make a lot of money on their apartments, maybe they would be selling more.
I was perplexed by that story, and I don't know what to make of it either, because the New York Times, that was a Crain story, and the New York Times wrote in a story this weekend that said, there are bargains in Manhattan compared with everyone else. I do know this, we are not producing enough housing in New York. We produced only 20,000 units of new housing, permits for new housing last year. In 2008, we produced 30,000. The population's growing. We do have a housing crisis. I would say it's a little different than the one Bill de Blasio thinks. It's not just about affordable housing. We are not building enough housing.
If the city is growing in population and we're supposed to reach 9 million people, it's almost 8.5 now, I think, why doesn't the market just produce a lot of housing because they could sell a lot of housing?
That's a good question. We're building way too much super luxury housing. On a per unit basis, the prices were extraordinary last year, but there are too many of those super luxury towers eating up all the money on 57th Street. The real estate community would tell you it's because it's too costly to build and they can't afford to build. Other people think that real estate is making just too much money on it and only wants to build the most high-end stuff.
Because they can do that with low risk and not have to take the smaller margins of building for the 95%.
Right. So where's the answer in this? I actually think we have to get to a good answer if we're going to solve this problem. The de Blasio answer is affordable housing, mandatory inclusionary zoning, force people to put more affordable housing. It will fail, though, if we don't build more housing in total.
The real estate industry bought into de Blasio's proposed reform of the so-called 421A program, that is, what kind of tax breaks and tax incentives developers get to build new housing that includes some affordable housing. It's the tenant activists who are now unhappy with the mayor, the real estate industry that's now aligned with him on this. Did he cave to something?
Well, I've talked to a lot of people, and not the big real estate developers either, but people who do affordable housing, who say we just can't build without 421A. The tenant advocates assume that there are these enormous profits in these buildings, right? And they'll build it anyway and just devote 20% of the housing or 30% of the housing to affordable. I've had relatively low small affordable housing developers say, no, we just can't build without it. Now, are there some things
without those tax breaks?
Now, are there some clear things everybody agrees on? Sure. There shouldn't be 421A tax breaks for condos. That's not a good idea. Will inclusionary zoning work? I don't know. The Furman Center, which is a pretty progressive organization, says there are lots of neighborhoods where the rents are not high enough to incentivize developers to build with 20% affordable. There's a big housing conference I'm doing this week. Those are the issues on the table.
And real estate somehow involved in this Dean Skelos scandal, the Senate Majority Leader of the state Senate, who had to resign. Now, it looks like the big real estate mogul who he was involved with may have actually been the victim of his corruption. But how do you see that?
What good words.
Alleged
involved,
corruption.
Blah, blah, blah. And not just Skelos, it's Silver, too,
yes.
The Silver indictment. We're talking about the same firm here, Glenwood. Glenwood is the biggest contributor to political campaigns in the state, the governor, and many other people. Both parties. In both cases, it would appear from the indictments allege that Silver and Skelos demanded that Glenwood, in essence, bribe them through referral to a law firm for property tax breaks. In the Silver case, title insurance, and another example in the Skelos case, as the quid pro quo for doing what they wanted on rent regulation. Now, I think rent regulation is really bad for New York. Most New Yorkers think rent regulation is a godsend. The real estate industry operates in an incredibly hostile political and media atmosphere. We knew before now that they used every tool at their disposal in campaign finance to pour tens of millions of dollars into campaigns to defend themselves. You may think that's not a good thing, but at least it was within the law, legal. The Glenwood participation in these two cases suggests that beyond campaign contributions, they were willing to pay bribes. Now, you could argue that they were shakedowns, maybe, but was it just Glenwood? Was Glenwood the only company paying bribes? Glenwood is not the only company whose future is dependent on these laws. I've been covering real estate in New York for 30 years. I don't know that I was ever more depressed than I read the Skelos indictment for what it says about what the real estate community in New York could be doing.
Meaning
Meaning,
there may be many of these schemes yet to be revealed?
yes, meaning how far does bribery extend? Is Glenwood an outlier, or is Glenwood more typical of what transactions take place between powerful leaders like the Assembly Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader and big real estate firms? There are other real estate firms that, in the Times immortal phrase, make cameo appearances in those indictments. We'll see if the U.S. Attorney has more indictments to come. You know, he hasn't been very interested in the briber. He's interested in the bribee, because he's politicians, because he's out to end public corruption. It's a very interesting twist in these cases.
Time will tell, and the U.S. Attorney, Preet Bharara, will tell, if he can figure it out, how much more there is. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. A new study finds that 4 out of 10 voters, Democrats and Republicans alike, treat politics much like a team sport, putting party loyalty above other considerations like the candidate or her ideas. What's more, a large number of voters believes in using aggressive and foul tactics to win the game. Party is not primary for only about 1 in 3 voters. Joining us, the paper's author, University of Kansas political scientist Patrick Miller. His study, Red and Blue States of Mind, Partisan Hostility and Voting in the United States. It was published in the Political Research Quarterly. Professor Miller joins us on Skype from Lawrence, Kansas, where the university is. Hello from New York.
Hi, nice to be with you.
What basic research question were you trying to answer in this study?
Well, let me take you back a little bit. We noticed a few years ago from a lot of public polling that there was a lot of increasing animosity between average Democrats and Republicans, increasing social distance, less likely to have cross-party conversations or friends of the other party, and isolating ourselves in more politically homogeneous communities. So we were interested in to what extent voters are looking at parties and elections as more symbolic, in-group, out-group, us versus them affairs, rather than being about issues necessarily. So that was our core motivating question.
And you found a change over time?
Well, we're the first study to look at these particular dynamics about valuing winning versus policy or political incivility. So we don't have a good benchmark for comparison. Our first survey was in 2010, and we found very similar results for 2012. But there are some survey measures on related items that we have over time. For example, on the question of whether you would be upset if a child of yours married someone of the other party. In the 1960s, I believe, only about 10% of partisans said they would be upset. Today, that's a majority, though.
How did you measure partisan rooting versus interest in the issues?
Well, we first started off by, it was an original survey, so we first wanted to interview some voters, some partisans, and get into their minds about how they think about these issues. And one thing that we noticed in just listening to, it was 50 individuals we interviewed, is that they talked about winning versus policy as if they were distinct and separate kinds of phenomena, that one mattered to you or the other. They didn't really connect that in order to advance policy, you generally have to win. So we started with this question of, well, what matters to you more, essentially. It wasn't the exact wording, but we said, when it comes to an election, does just winning matter more than policy, or does policy matter more than the victory? So it was something to that effect. And that stemmed from our interviews.
It's a little surprising to me that they would be that separate. Like if you want to win, if you feel strongly about winning on a policy issue, let's say raising taxes on the rich, whichever way you feel about that, you want to win because you think it's important that the thing happen, right?
Perhaps, but I would always caution, and I don't mean to be overly critical in this, but we have decades of research that tell us that voters are not intimately and rationally tuned into policy. They have relatively low levels of policy knowledge, unless there's an issue they really care about. And on most policy matters, even very contentious issues like abortion or Obamacare or same-sex marriage, they don't care very much. So I think for the average voter, they're more attached to their party, and they know that they're in a party, and issues might come up at certain times during a campaign, and they care about it at that point in time. But I think they're much more party-centric in knowing this is my group, those are the enemies, and let's get my group to the victory line. Interesting.
So let's look at your numbers a little bit. One of them was 40% of Americans who vote consider themselves to be party loyalists over interested in the issue. What's the 40% number?
Well, that was 41% of Democrats and Republicans. With independents, it's typical in political science to categorize independents as pure independents or who lean to one party. And that's an important distinction because most independents are not really independents. We actually call them closet partisans. They're just as partisan and ideological as partisans oftentimes. They just don't like the label. And so lumping them together with people who call themselves Democrats and Republicans, that was about 90% of the public. So that 40% figure is 40% of that 90%. So if you're looking to say a percentage of Americans, it's about, math in my head, maybe 36% or so.
So should we consider this troubling or should we consider this reassuring? Because either way, it's a minority of Americans who consider politics a team sport as opposed to a way to advance society.
Well, we had a quarter of partisans who were kind of indifferent on the measure. They said that they both matter equally. And only 35% said that, well, it's policy that matters most to me. I think the deeper question is really, well, what are people valuing? And I think from a normative perspective, we want people to be motivated by policy. We don't want them necessarily, and this goes back to how our founders thought about parties. Even though they gave us parties, they cautioned us against being attached to factions and putting loyalty to factions above rational policy making and the good of the republic. And I think that these results that we're seeing tell us that we may be seeing for many voters more loyalty to the party above the public good.
Does this reinforce itself as a cycle? And so you can't get presidential candidates, for example, who are going to choose some ideas from each party and say, this is my individual judgment that this is actually the best set of ideas?
Well, from other studies, not that my co-author Pam Conover and I have done, but we know that generally primary voters are not looking for moderates or centrists or even necessarily mainstream conservatives or liberals. They tend to prefer purists, people who are loyal to the party and who symbolically fit with the party. And so I think there is a bit of a vicious cycle here in that if you look at the people who are producing our nominees, not just for the presidency, but for Congress, they are more uncivil. They want purity. And so that gives us politicians who are more uncivil and don't compromise. But I think especially with what we've seen in primaries, more so on the Republican side, has demonstrated that for politicians who are not pure enough, there's a cost to be paid in a primary if you moderate too much. So politicians have to pander to those voters, but those voters are also constraining the politicians.
So now that you've set a baseline on some of this research, what's your follow-up study going to be?
Well, right now we're delving more into the civility aspect of this. I mean, it surprised us very much to see among the people who said that winning by any means necessary is something I endorse, just the kind of things that they said. We asked an open-ended question, what do you mean? And we got answers like physical violence and intimidation, not letting the other side talk, stealing elections. And so right now we're just delving more into that incivility aspect and thinking about that in terms of not just uncivil acts, but also how you think of the other side. I mean, do you demonize, morally especially, the other party? Do you have an open mind in terms of conversation with that? So that's what we're focused on right now.
So this playing dirty, I presume you didn't test deflating footballs, but how about closing a bridge to get back at a local mayor who didn't endorse you for governor? People would see that as okay if they were Republicans?
I believe so. I mean, one thing we know about political scandals, I mean, and we've known this for quite a long time, is that we are most of the time quite forgiving of political scandals, unless they're especially egregious. But we're quite forgiving of scandals if it's someone of our own party. Especially on corruption matters, maybe a little less so on sexual matters if you're a Republican. But, I mean, yeah, I think with the Chris Christie case, for a lot of Republicans, they either see it maybe as not a big deal or he's being persecuted.
Well, thanks for joining us. Really interesting study.
Thank you.
And that's Public Intellectual for this week. Coming up next, Unearthing Central Park's fallen arches, so bikers and walkers don't collide. Summer is almost here, and with the warmer weather comes more cyclists and pedestrians competing for space. It's also an unfortunate seasonal reminder of the danger that killed 2 pedestrians in Central Park last year when New Yorker Irving Schachter and Jill Tarlov from Connecticut tragically collided with bicyclists navigating the park's central traffic loop. Our next guest sees a solution in the park's original design. Matt Falber is a park tour guide and executive director of the Central Park Arch Project. Welcome.
Thanks.
And we're going to show a lot of visuals. We'll get to them in a minute. But what's the basic idea here? What are the arches and what do they have to do with pedestrian safety?
You know, it's very interesting, Brian. A lot of people don't even realize that there are arches in the park until I point it out to them. But basically, they separate the grade that people are walking through. And Olmsted and Vox, the architects of Central Park, initially strove to separate riders on horseback, carriages, and pedestrians so that they would never have to walk out in front of the other type of traffic. So you might be on a walking path and all of a sudden the grade sort of lowers, and meanwhile just above you there's cars that are passing.
So hang on, I think we have a good example to show right away.
Yeah.
There it is.
There it
People
is.
are going to say, oh, that.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see another one, another arch in the park. Maybe people will recognize.
That's Greywhack Arch.
Which is where exactly?
That's up by the museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and designed by Calvert Vaux and Jacob Ray Mold. It's one of the only arches in the park that actually is named after the material it's built from. That's a rock Greywhack.
How about that? And one more.
That is Pine Bank Arch, which is a cousin to one of the arches that was actually destroyed that we're looking to put back in the park.
Is this near the reservoir?
No, there are several cast iron bridges near the reservoir. That's similar look, but this is actually on a stretch of bridle path, which is down by the Heckscher Playground and Heckscher Ball Field.
Okay.
And just past that road there, the road actually ends because the rest of the bridle path was removed.
And actually, I said that was the last one, but we have one more, and that's a very different looking arch.
Yes, all of the arches are completely different. And this particular one is in the Ramble. It's called Ramble Arch.
And so up above there, there's the roadway, part of the Park Drive.
This one is actually very different than most of them. All of them were built to separate different forms of transportation. This is the only arch in the park that is actually meant to put people on the bottom and people on the top.
And if nothing else, this will serve to train people's eyes next time they're in Central Park.
Absolutely.
And they'll see all those arches that they might have just taken for granted before.
Do a little detective work. What's this one for?
So then there are ones that are buried.
Yes. There's one arch that is buried, actually. And it's near the Central Park Mall, which is the one straight path in the park that's got the benches and the beautiful American elm trees lining it. And
I think we have a map of the park
Oh.
on which you could identify that spot.
Yes, there is a very good map. Right where 13 is on that map is the end and the beginning of the mall. And the...
About what street again? What's the cross street, roughly?
That's near 65th Street.
Right.
Yeah. And what you're looking at, actually, that line that goes from the top of that map to the bottom is the 65th Street Transverse Road, which is where we got these arches in the first place. Olmsted and Vaux, when they built the park, really had safety in mind from the very beginning. A lot of people entered a competition to decide who would get to build the park, and everyone else had to put these pathways in that separated the park from east to west. Olmsted and Vaux were the only ones to lower the grade below the surface and to build archways so that people never had to cross streets.
But there were no cars then. It was the 1800s,
Right.
wasn't
You're
it?
Right. It really was a stroke of brilliance on their part. There was, not only were there no cars, there was nobody living in that part of town. But they looked at Broadway in Lower Manhattan, where women who at the time were wearing corsets, so it was difficult for them to get around, had to be escorted by police across the street because it was so busy. And there were a lot of accidents that happened down there. And they looked at that and said, we want to prevent that type of thing from ever happening up here.
Pathways, too, not just arches.
Yes.
Also from the original design, right?
Right. So in designing this park, they came up with more than 30 different arches to separate the traffic so that people could move and not have to worry about walking out in front of other types of vehicles or horses in that time. But several changes have been made to the park over the years, and additional things like the Great Lawn or Shakespeare in the Park or Tavern on the Green have now popped up. And in certain places, it's almost as if somebody put a ruler down on a map and said, well, we're going to draw the path to Shakespeare in the Park right this way. And literally 50 feet away, there's an archway. So eliminating that straight line that goes to a dangerous crosswalk and allowing people to walk under an archway that's right there could prevent accidents almost immediately.
And we've got another image to show that I think will let you exemplify this further.
Yes. That is exactly up by Shakespeare in the Park, just as I was discussing. And you can see people can come in at 81st Street there. We used Google Maps to get these particular roads, and actually there's a pathway that is not even on there. But if you look up by 81st Street, there's that path that goes down. There's actually a path already that connects straight to that curving pathway that goes to Winterdale Arch. So literally, it's a choice between, do I walk left to cross the street or do I walk right? And we took a group of 40 people through the park and took them around to the different arches. And of the people, one woman said, well, I always take the arch. Why would anybody walk out into the crosswalk? The rest of the 39 people said, we didn't even know there was an arch there.
Yeah, there you go. And there's that arch, right?
Yeah. This one's at a particularly dangerous section, too. In 2014, the Department of Transportation did a study looking at sites where collisions were happening, and right by Shakespeare in the Park was where the most were happening. Olmsted and Vox sort of built the park in a very English way, where they wanted things to sort of unfold for you. You discover new things as you go around corners. Well, that's really a great way to walk in the park, but as you're driving, this is at the bottom of a hill. So if you're on a bicycle and things are unfolding and you can't really see what's in front of you and you're picking up speed all the way down, before you know it, you've got people crossing that you might not have expected were going to be there. So in this particular location, the usage of the archway could be a really big difference.
Yeah. I think this is an image of
a
buried arch.
Yeah, yeah.
So it looks like it's here in this image. So what are we actually seeing?
So this is the one that we were talking about that's right below the mall. And this really was a work of art. Clarence Cook, who was a journalist at the time, wrote a description of the park. And he said that this was one of the most beautiful parts of Central Park. It's made of marble from a Westchester quarry. And when you go down, if you look at the very back there, you can sort of see it looks like there's a fountain. There's a drinking fountain back there and a grotto where people were able to sit. And that light source that you see is actually because in the middle of the arch, they built these two grand marble staircases that went up and took people to the mall. And a man named Robert Moses, who I'm sure you're familiar with, he was the Parks Commissioner from 1934 until the 1960s.
And considered the master builder.
The master builder.
He built all those highways
Yes.
and housing projects and everything else. So the master builder was also the person who decided to tear down this beautiful thing?
Yes. He often built, but he was very good at getting money for things. And oftentimes that involved new construction, not restoring things. Particularly when the WPA was involved during the Depression. But the particular Marble Arch that we were looking at, he modified that stretch of road because he wanted to make it more accessible for cars. And he didn't think that it was wide enough. So the simple solution was, well, let's just ignore it. And demolishing it would have been quite an effort. So we do know that it was partly demolished and buried. The question is how much of it is intact underground.
Now, what do you mean buried? They would take big chunks of that structure, and what? Like dig graves for it and bury it under the... I mean, what does buried mean in this case?
Yeah, like we were talking about, you've got to change the grade in order to get people to go down and under an arch. So right now, there is no grade change. You actually walk over the arch that goes over the transverse road at 65th Street, and the ground is flat, straight across to the mall. So they probably, we know that the arch is underground because pieces of it have surfaced. They've pulled marble from the park. But there is significant documentation that says essentially what they did was just collapse the top of it. So those walls on either side are the things that might still be there.
Tell us about Oak Bridge. We're going to see this up here. This is one that was restored, right?
This is one that was also destroyed in 1935 during Robert Moses' tenure. And he replaced it. It was a cast iron bridge, so essentially it was not taken care of. It rusted. He replaced it with a very boring sort of concrete and wood bridge. And the Central Park Conservancy, who does a wonderful job of looking after the park, raises 75% of their annual budget, in 2009 came and from drawings that are in the city's municipal archive, reconstructed this bridge. And it today is actually made of steel and pine rather than oak and cast iron, but it's gorgeous. And what was initially intended to be in the park.
I was going to say, what you see of the structure there is gorgeous, and the view from there is gorgeous.
Yeah.
So what a great combination.
Yeah.
So is anybody listening to your suggestions?
We've had some really good interest. We are talking with a few people that are in the city council. We've had people from community boards speak with us. We've got some conversations going with a number of different city agencies. So we're very optimistic. The reception for this has been overwhelmingly positive. So.
And in the meantime, enforce the new bicycle speed limit.
Yes, yes. Well, we're all about safety. Absolutely.
Vision zero, and that might mean a vision of a restored Central Park and some of its original beauty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian.
And that's our program for today. We're here each week at this hour. Next time, a new plan to rebuild New York's Penn Station. Not just the conversion of the main post office for Amtrak that we know about, but in addition to that, reconstructing the 1910 station from its original plans. That's here on the TV program next week, but also tune into my radio program weekday mornings at 10 a.m. on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow is your nail salon reforming opportunity. Is the one you go to if you use nail salons, reforming its labor practices after the New York Times expose. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.